What's going on, everyone? This is the 5th episode of the Becoming Conscious podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Nelson, and today I have a very special guest on the podcast. Her name is Tracy Winterstein. She is the owner of a float spa here in Omaha, Nebraska. And in this episode, we discuss a little bit about the practical realities of floating, some of the benefits of floating in a sensory deprivation tank, and why you should float. And a few days after I did this interview, I had the chance to float at this float spa, and it was a great experience. And here are a few of the insights that I had after the floating experience. So first of all, I think that being in a sensory deprivation tank is an amazing place to practice meditation and or contemplation. In my own experience, it's much easier to turn inwards and to do self-inquiry or meditation or whatever consciousness practice you have when you're in this type of environment. And so the first insight I had was that being present and completely satisfied with the here and the now, and just noticing all the sounds, sights, and external stimuli without being lost in thought is an act of non-conformity in our society. It's not promoted at all. Yes, I know that there's a mindfulness movement and a big push for people to practice basic meditation, but this hasn't really percolated very much into the actions of those living in our society. We're still living in this very egoic and just this society where everyone feels the need to constantly stimulate themselves into, it's just normal to be lost in thought all the time. Therefore, if you want to be in the here and the now and live completely in the present moment, you have to challenge the status quo, which means that you'll face resistance from cultural norms, which makes it a lot harder to live in the present. You might ask what this has to do with floating, and here's what I found, is that when I exited the float tank, I felt that I had less resistance to being present, and I was like in this immune state to the resistance of the culture of living in the present moment. I felt like it was natural to live in the present moment, and I wasn't really feeling as much resistance of just observing everything in my environment from almost like a third person point of view. I wasn't so caught up in my egoic mode of thinking, and I was more deeply experiencing the present moment and just witnessing everything that's going on. So that being said, I think floating is a very powerful experience. I think that there's different degrees of profundity or experience that we can get from the float tank. Some people can go very deeply into themselves, and for others who are just starting, it can just be a great way to relax and to take a little bit off your shoulders from all the stress and anxiety that our culture puts on us. And these are some of the things that we talk about in the interview. So I hope you guys enjoy it, and here it is. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Tracy Winterstein of the Omaha Float Spa, the owner of the Omaha Float Spa, to talk about sensory deprivation tanks and floating. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I want to start it out. For the absolute layman with no experience with floating, can you explain to them kind of what floating is and why they should?
Well, floating, to somebody who's never heard of it before, it is a Epsom salt bath, in that you lay in about 8.5 to 9.5 inches of water and 850 to 1,000 pounds of Epsom salt. It's an hour of absolutely nothing. You don't have any feeling in that you're floating. You don't have any sound. We get rid of all the sound barriers, and we get rid of all the light. There's no outside stimuli whatsoever.
So what would you say, what does it kind of like feel like to be in a float tank? Like what's like the state of mind? Like is it like a meditative state or what?
Most people who don't meditate have issues with the word meditation, so we try to tend to say it's more of a relaxed state. If people have meditated before, then absolutely they can get into a meditative state really quickly. But for people who haven't, it's more of a relaxed state of you just have nothing in your mind and you can kind of quietly just somewhat fade away.
It kind of just like lessens your thoughts and just...
That's what our goal is to have happen.
And so it's helpful for like decreasing like stress and like anxiety and everything.
It has been shown to be very good at decreasing your stress levels. And also we have a lot of people who float for anxiety and depression, and that has been shown to help with that. As for, it also helps with your muscle recovery after hard workouts, or your back pain, chronic pain. We've had people with arthritis that float quite a bit, and it sure helps with their pain.
So for some people, including myself, for like they just don't really float because there's kind of this fear of like what it's going to be like without any of your stimuli in your environment, and it kind of just freaks some people out. How can you maybe lessen this fear? Like what would someone need to understand to be less fearful?
Knowing full well that you're in control of your entire float. With that being said, you have control over all the lighting. You can leave the light on if that's what you want. You can actually even leave the music on if you would like music. We play a calm meditation music soundtrack, and if you want that on the entire time, that is your choice. And also you can open the door or close the door. So I want people to know that they always have full control of the entire hour.
And a lot of people, when I told them about this, the first thing they always ask me is, can you drown?
There is absolutely no way you can. Because of the saturation point of the water, it is physically impossible for you to drown in there, even if you do fall asleep.
So basically, say you roll over, you just immediately wake up.
Yeah, you'll immediately wake up because of either the salt in your mouth or the salt in your eyes. There is just no possible way you will not wake up from that.
So yeah, definitely can't drown.
Nope.
So say someone gets past that fear, once they're going to their first float, what's kind of the right state of mind or like physical state to be in? Like, do you not want to have sugar or like caffeine or anything before entering it?
We do ask that people try to refrain from caffeine or coffee in the morning if they're floating in the morning. That's just because you want your brain to be able to shut off, and caffeine tends to make your brain go kind of bonkers. So we do ask that you do not eat also. We don't want you having any kind of pains that way. We also ask that maybe you come into it with not a lot of expectations. We don't want people coming in here thinking, oh my God, my back is going to be cured if I float, because that just is not a realistic expectation of floating.
All right, so when you're floating, how long is the typical float? Because like when I float, I kind of just I take it with the mindset of it being a meditation. And when I try meditating, it's really hard to do it for more than 30 minutes. But I feel like a float would be much easier to just relax for longer periods of time.
Right. We do have most people float for 1 hour. Now, more experienced floaters sure can float a lot longer. We do have our regulars that float for 90 minutes. But I would say the majority of the people are 45 minutes to an hour, and they get the most benefit from that time in that they've had time to relax and also kind of reflect and reset, and they're ready to get on with their week or their day.
So you mentioned earlier how some people, when you're in the float tank, some people tend to fall asleep. But even if you fall asleep, isn't there some statistic about how it puts you into a deeper sleep?
There is some findings that say once you get into that theta state of, which is right before you fall asleep, is the most restorative sleep you can get into. And I think of it as if you get into, think of when you take a nap at home and you can kind of hear stuff around you, but you can't open your eyes. That is the state you want to be in when you're in the tank or the cabin. And you'll notice when people are in that state, or when they come out and they've been in that state, they'll say, God, I thought I was only in there 15 minutes. And that's when I know that their mind has completely relaxed and their body has relaxed and they've gotten the most advantages out of the float.
Yeah, so it's not always that they fall asleep, that they just get into that state of like semi-waking,
right,
semi-awake state where they still kind of can hear stuff, but they're just not really.
Yep, they're
running at full speed.
Yes, and that is a great relaxation state to be in. And if you can get there, that is the most absolute benefit you can get from floating.
Since floating, you're laying in hundreds of pounds of Epsom salt. Is there benefits to Epsom salt? I mean, I don't know. Some would think that there might not. There might be detriments to laying in that much salt for that amount of time, but...
Well, the benefit, Epsom salt has tons of benefits. It's magnesium sulfate, and magnesium's good for everything from sleep to stress reduction to fibromyalgia treatments to anything like that. That magnesium has been shown to show benefit if you have enough. And I think there's a statistic out there that like 75% of the United States population is magnesium deficient. And most people do take a supplement, but with the supplement, we don't know how much our body is absorbing. At least with floating, we know it's absorbing through our skin, which is the best receptor for it. Now, you cannot get too much magnesium. Our body magnesium is one thing that our body does not take in too much of. It will secrete it via kidneys. So there's no worry about getting too much magnesium.
So it's kind of like a natural remedy to the magnesium problem.
Very natural.
So let's just go over what are just some of the benefits of this floating experience.
Okay, the benefits we see the most are, of course, stress relief, pain reduction, both in acute pain and chronic pain, reduced inflammation. For example, people who have had knee surgery will come in afterwards and reducing the inflammation will help them with their pain. We see a lot of people that get a lot of benefits from more restful sleep after they have floated. We also we have a program where we treat PTSD victims, or that veterans who can come to us and we will let them float to see if they can help with their ailments.
So when people exit the tank, I've been hearing this term in the floating community called post-float glow. What kind of is post-float glow? Do you think it's just kind of exiting this meditative state or this relaxed state, one state?
I think it is a sense of peace that people have when they get done. It is a sense of you just feel okay with everything. You're okay to start your day, to finish your day, to be around people, to just face the world. And either they're smiling or they're relaxed and they just feel okay with everything. I think nowadays we have such a stressful surroundings, being with everything in the news, to our kids, to our work, that if we can integrate just an hour of complete peace and relaxation, it would do a lot of people a ton of good.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think we're living in a very hectic, stressful society. And
very much so.
So what I got from that is kind of just like they're just more open and less.
It's more of I'm okay with what everything's happening around me. So when I first floated for the very first time, I was in Dallas floating, and I came out of there about 4:30, so I had to drive an hour in Dallas traffic. And usually I'm a very stressed driver in that I like to get places. I don't like to sit and wait. And I had a sense of, I'm okay with this. it was really a weird sensation that I don't usually feel very often. And I knew right then and there that something was up with this floating. To be in that sense of I'm okay with my surroundings, and something that usually stresses me out was fine.
Yeah, so like emotional control, kind of just being able to like watch your emotions. And
That is the absolute good explanation of what I felt from the very first time.
So, what about claustrophobia in the tank? Because it's kind of, you're just in this tank, enclosed in this tank for an hour. Do some people, is it like really open, or what about claustrophobia?
Well, the tank is very enclosed in that you do have to get into it and close somewhat of a door. But in reality, claustrophobic people are claustrophobic because they don't have control of a situation. And when we take that control and give it to the person, to the floater, it takes that away a little bit. My 16-year-old floats probably the most out of anybody in our family, and he loves the tank, and he explains the tank as you feel very hugged and secure in there, which is a great feeling for a lot of people to feel secure, and he likes that feeling of being hugged. Now the cabin, which he likes, is for more if people just do not want to float in the tank. We do have the cabin, and that's more open. We do tend to put people that are claustrophobic in there, so that you don't have anything that's closed over you.
The cabin's just like a higher ceiling.
Absolutely.
And then the tank is just
Enclosed. Yep.
So, from what I researched, floating's been around a while. So, like, it's kind of starting to grow, and more people are starting to hear about it, but it's definitely not like super new.
No, it's not new. It was in the 60s. It started in the 60s. And, now it's becoming kind of commonplace in that they're doing a lot of research. There's a guy in Oklahoma that's doing research on anxiety and depression, and he's been funded to do this research. And it's really some interesting stuff that's coming out of it, saying that some of these individuals are getting a lot of benefit from floating. So we're hoping that it becomes more mainstream, in that just like a massage, it's it's for your mind and your body at the same time. So we're hoping that it becomes more mainstream, and that anybody can give it a try.
So, who is floating for? Like, what types of people typically come and float? And
Okay, well, we have a variety of people. We have anywhere from your age that really are more doing it for their mind and just that resetting, and also for muscle recovery from sports, to pregnancy. We have a lot of pregnant women that'll come in and float. And then we also, of course, have older individuals with arthritis that float. So it's not a specific gender or a specific ailment. It's just whoever really wants to spend an hour to work on themselves.
so I'm 17, by the way, if you didn't know. So even for people that are in school, have to decompress and let out some stress after maybe a long night of homework or something. And it sounds like people who want to decompress after their business day.
Absolutely. We do have, a lot of creative individuals that also float to kind of, they're not saying that they get more creative by the floating, but they're more productive when they're not floating, and that their mind is more focused.
So yeah, rather than getting distracted
Right.
every 10 minutes or so,
Right.
they can focus more. I think that's about it. Thank you again for the interview so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming by.
Sweet. As always, thank you guys for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you haven't already, I encourage you to check out the supplementary YouTube channel that goes along with this podcast, also titled Becoming Conscious, as well as the blog becomeconscious.org, where I share some of my insights in the written format. You can also find the show notes for this episode at becomeconscious.org/BC5. And in the show notes, I link the Omaha Float Spa Facebook page, website, and an article about it in omaha.com. And I also link to a few documentaries about floating if you're interested in pursuing it further. One is called Float Nation, and the other is a documentary 3-part series by Vice, both on YouTube, both for free. Highly recommend checking them out. So if you want to check them out, just go to the show notes. Again, becomeconscious.org/BC4. I am starting to post new short films on YouTube about the similar topics that I talk about on this podcast, so I encourage you to check those out. And if you enjoyed the show, please consider supporting it by either leaving a 5-star review on iTunes. That is much appreciated to help this podcast get into the ears of new people. Or you can also support me over on Patreon at patreon.com/becomeconscious. And on Patreon, I release private, short-length podcasts and films about the weekly insights I'm having along the Becoming Conscious journey. And I truly appreciate every single patron that supports me over on Patreon. And I am trying to get to a couple goals where I will be releasing private Q&A live streams if I get enough patrons. So head on over and support the Becoming Conscious movement or community. So thank you guys very much. That about wraps it up for today, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode. So have a good one.